Hold it. Stop right there. Question right now. What is your favorite Final Fantasy game ever? I don't care if it's a mainline game. I don't care if it's a side game. Let me know in the comments below right now. What is your favorite Final Fantasy game? If you're wondering why I'm even asking you at the very beginning of this video, it's because there are more rumors spreading around right now that we might be getting something with Final Fantasy IX. And if you ask a lot of mainline Final Fantasy fans, 9 is usually pretty high up on their tier list. You know, it could be 7 as number 1, it could be 10 as number 1, but 9 is always in the top 5 for most people. And there's a good reason for it. It is a beloved game. But why the heck am I bringing up a game from 2000? Well, if you have not been paying attention to any of the news, especially with TGS having just wrapped up here in Japan, then you might not have seen this interview with Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P. If you don't know who this is, he's the main head behind Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XVI, which are for the most part loved by many people. Now, during this interview, a lot of it was mostly asking about Final Fantasy XIV, what we can expect from some of the DLC, what are his favorite mini games, and other things like that. You know, your typical interview questions. But one question that came across was, if you could remake any classic Final Fantasy game, what would you make? And he says here, and I quote, "Oh man, that's a super tough question. The one that I would like to make myself would be Final Fantasy III, I think. Of course, I do know there are requests for Final Fantasy IX to be made. And when you think about Final Fantasy IX, it's a game with huge volume. When you think of all of that volume, I wonder if it's possible to remake that as a single title. It's a difficult one. It's a tough question. Now, on the surface, this may look like a very random question to ask, and there's no new information or anything like that, no confirmation whatsoever. But if you've been paying attention to anything in the PC gaming space when it comes to graphics cards and NVIDIA, regardless if you actually like their products or anything like that, Final Fantasy IX has actually been data mined sometimes whenever we get new features or downloads or drivers, especially when it comes to those particular cards. If you don't know what a driver is essentially an update that keeps your graphics card up to date with new games so that they work at their best possible settings and everything like that. So taking some of the drivers that we've seen that reference Final Fantasy IX, and now we have Yoshi P talking about Final Fantasy IX as well in terms of a remake, a lot of people are starting to speculate, oh, are we finally going to get an announcement for Final Fantasy IX Remake? Because if you think about it, there's no new Final Fantasy game at this particular point that's going to be coming out very soon. Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 is still underway, and that's probably going to release in 2027, which also is the 30th anniversary of Final Fantasy VII itself. Final Fantasy XVI just released on PC, and we have no idea whatsoever about what's happening with Final Fantasy XVII. And there could be some other side games, but other than that, not much is really known. So could we see another remake or remaster of another Final Fantasy game that hasn't been out in quite some time? Now, obviously, Final Fantasy IX can be bought on pretty much every platform, Steam, PSN, even Switch. But that's the old game, right? And if you've been a Final Fantasy fan for some time, then you most likely would buy pretty much any Final Fantasy game or at least try it out no matter what happens. But what about trying to bring in new players? Regardless of how you feel about Final Fantasy XVI and the route that it went with its gameplay and everything like that, it is noted that Final Fantasy XVI was actually successful in bringing in a ton of new players to the Final Fantasy franchise. So, what's another game that a lot of people would love to see that's not Final Fantasy VII and not the newest Final Fantasy XVI? Well, a lot of people would love to see something like either Final Fantasy X, maybe Final Fantasy VIII, but a big one, as always, is going to be Final Fantasy IX. And even though most of us longtime players would buy this in an instant, there is a lot of younger gamers who look at something like Final Fantasy IX and just think, oh, that's kind of an old game, or some of the gameplay might not be as up-to-date as it possibly could be. I mean, granted, this was made back in 2000. If you actually take off the nostalgia glasses, you know that there are sometimes things like game mechanics and other things that just simply don't work anymore. And that's not to say, again, that the game is bad or anything. That's just a way that older games are. They were limited by the technology at the time, so it's always cool to potentially think of what could get a fresh coat of paint to make the game that we love even better. Since Final Fantasy IX is so big, could it be done in terms of a remake in one full game? And oh boy, did the internet go into crazy mode, or at least more crazy than usual. It's the internet. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's referring to the fact that Final Fantasy VII Remake is not just a single game, and it's broken up into 3. A lot of people are not a big fan of this because it basically means instead of getting one game at that moment, we have to wait up to potentially 10 years or so to get 3 games, especially with how long it takes to develop games this day and age. So I want to talk about this, and of course, as always, leave your comments down below, but I want to cover 3 big topics. First off, what is the actual difference between a remake and a remaster? Because unfortunately, over the years, these two words have been mixed and matched all over the gaming space, and I feel like a lot of people don't actually understand the real definitions of these two words. Second, I want to talk about Final Fantasy IX itself and if it would work better as something like a remaster. Again, we'll get into exact examples of that, or would an actual remake work for this thing? And finally, will this just happen, essentially, right? Is seeing data mine drivers and everything from GPUs a sign that we are going to see this game? Or is it potentially just named something like that and it's more going to be a remaster, or simply just had some updates to work with the current version of the game that's out right now, you know, the one from 2000. So if you enjoy these type of discussions or anything regarding Final Fantasy, we've covered Final Fantasy 16, 7 Remake, Rebirth, and of course when Part 3 comes out, we cover all that stuff. So make sure you sub to the channel if you want to keep up to date on all this type of news, and we'll post videos as fast as we possibly can. Or if you want to talk to us live at our live stream, by all means, stop on by. We always love chatting with you. But with that being said, I'm Talon with Direct Gaming. Let's get into this. Starting off, let's talk about what is the difference between a remake and a remaster. Let's start with the remaster term. Now, this term, unfortunately, in this day and age, is kind of a taboo term when it comes to gamers in general, just because of how many remasters there have actually been. So what exactly is a remaster? Well, first off, it's kind of your simple graphical upgrade. Nothing much has really changed. You'll see changes in character textures and things like that, maybe some of the world environments, but overall, it's basically a texture upgrade, maybe some improvements to gameplay, but overall, there's really no big change. A perfect example of some remasters could be anything from some old 2D games, which are simply just re-released onto modern consoles with a few texture improvements here or there, all the way up to the big remasters that we've seen lately, like Last of Us Part 2 or even Horizon Zero Dawn. And I know people are rolling their eyes at that, but that's just the way they are when it comes to remasters. Those are not remakes. Another way to look at a remaster is pretty much one-to-one in terms of what the old game used to be, with no big changes or improvements, again, aside from maybe some UI changes, or if there's something that's truly broken in the original version of the game, they'll make changes to that if they need to. And finally, the last point to kind of look at remasters is that unfortunately they're kind of looked at in a negative light because it's simply just taking a game that was made beforehand, touching it up a bit, and that's basically it. Again, nothing is really changing when it comes to any of these remasters. For the most part. Yes, we can look at something like Horizon Zero Dawn, which if you do look at it, it obviously has improved graphics. It does have some improved facial animations and everything like that. But overall, if you played the game back in 2018 when it originally released, guess what? It's the exact same game. Now, usually they do throw the DLC in, and sometimes I do feel that remasters kind of get combined with things like Director's Cut. If you don't remember Director's Cuts from back during the PS4 and the Xbox One days, that was basically taking a base game, throwing the DLC together, and just making it a Director's Cut that maybe had a few changes to it, but overall it was the same game, but just everything included. You might have also seen some terms like Game of the Year Edition, etc. It all really depends. A remake, on the other hand, can be very different. First off, a remake is a complete rework from the ground up, or at least taking the very basic concepts that were made during the original airing of that particular game, but then you literally upgrade everything to the best it possibly can be. Again, perfect example of a remake is going to be Final Fantasy VII Remake. Regardless of your thoughts on it, whether it's a split game or what they've done in terms of some of the gameplay choices or anything with the story in terms of what they've added on and everything like that, that is a remake. They went back in, and if you look at something like the original Final Fantasy VII and you compare it to now, it obviously looks very different, plays very different, has voice acting, all of that stuff. That is a remake right there. Another example of a remake that a lot of people will bring up will be something like Resident Evil 4, and while that one is not as drastic of a change compared to Final Fantasy VII, it still is a big improvement from the 2005 version that it originally released as. Another way to look at remakes, however, though, is that they can take a lot longer to make, especially with how old the game potentially might have been and what you're trying to upgrade in that particular time. I mean, heck, even trying to throw in voice acting, for example, or maybe do some motion capture, depending on if you're trying to do any particular cutscenes or remake those, because a lot of those games, especially made back in the old days, were not on a HD TV. They're more on a 4:3 aspect ratio, and they obviously need to be upgraded and everything like that. And finally, when it comes to a remake as well, this isn't necessarily when it comes to making it, but one thing that a remake can absolutely do is bring in the new generation of gamers who missed those games back in the day when they originally released. I mean, again, I'm not saying any old game from the past is bad or anything like that, but if you look at something like Final Fantasy, let's say 3, for example, a lot of gamers these days, especially if they're younger, are not going to give that game any chance. You're just going to look at it and be like, oh man, this looks like what my parents played back in the day and everything like that, right? Now, if they're not into the gameplay or anything like that, or they have tried it out and they don't like it, that's totally fine. But a lot of people, just based on looks alone, will not play it because they feel it's outdated. So a remake is a great way to kind of bring new players in and everything like that. Does it always work? No, it absolutely doesn't. But regardless, that is something that a remake can do. So hopefully this kind of gives you a basic idea of what the difference is between a remaster and a remake. I've seen some people call like The Last of Us Part 1 a remake, or I've even seen people try to call the Horizon Zero Dawn a remake. those are not remakes. Those are remasters. And even Naughty Dog themselves and other developers have said that when it comes to those particular types of remasters, where it's just more of a graphical fidelity update, a couple of things added in and not much more, most of that is done by kind of your B or C team, kind of the new interns coming into the company as they want to learn about the engines and everything like that. In fact, Naughty Dog themselves have said that, look, when it came to some of the remaster stuff, we let the smaller teams work on that. We maybe had 1 or 2 people from the A team, if you want to call it that, lead them a bit, but overall they were not throwing all this time that a lot of people think that they're wasting when it comes to these remasters and everything like that. Most likely the A team for something like Naughty Dog is working on their next big project, while the smaller teams or side teams are going to be working on these remasters. And of course we always have to look at, oh, is there a movie coming out? Is there a TV show? Is there this or that? Whatever the case is. Again, call it lazy if you want to, but it's not really taking away as much as people really think there are. And again, remakes take a much longer time. They have a lot more of an update usually to them, and things can change, whether it's gameplay, voice acting, cutscenes, and etc. Okay, so with that being said, what about Final Fantasy IX? If the data mines from the graphics drivers and everything like that are true, or this little interview hint from Yoshi P is anything to be believed when it comes to FF9, would this make more sense as a remaster or a remake? Especially when a lot of people would say, oh, I'd love to see this as a remake, but make sure it's one game. Now, we have to unfortunately get into one of the topics that I am honestly tired of talking about whenever it comes to something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, because a lot of people said, oh yeah, this should have just been one game. That's it. That's what the remake should have been. And at the level quality that we have seen when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Remake / Rebirth, you honestly are kidding yourself if you think that whole game, take the original Final Fantasy VII and how big that game is and try to put it into one game right now, especially when they told us about it and everything like that. That's not really possible. It's just not. So if we're going to try and take a big game like Final Fantasy IX and if you yourself want a full-on remake of the game, cutscenes with voice acting, new motion capture, brand new moves, the whole 9 yards, or even heck, you don't even have to say brand new moves, but just simply everything updated to look modern these days, that is going to take a lot of time. And especially with the size of the game, I guarantee you that would need to be broken down into 2 parts. You may not like to admit it, but that's just the case. Or if you're going to say, no, just make it one big, huge ass game. Okay, I hope you don't mind waiting 10 plus years to get all of that. Not to mention the fact that the game's probably gonna be like 400 or 500 gigabytes, because it's not the same as it was back then. So what could Final Fantasy IX look like as either a remaster or remake? Well, if they went the remaster route, then it would kind of be something similar to, at least the way I would personally look at it, like Dragon Quest HD 2V Remake that we're going to be getting pretty soon. Yes, I know that has the remake name in it, but probably more likely than not, it's probably closer to a remaster, at least the way I personally see when it comes to the gameplay trailers and all the previews and everything that we've seen. So Final Fantasy IX could easily do some kind of remaster where they update the graphics. Nothing's really changing in terms of the cutscenes or anything like that. Maybe they throw in some voice acting, but that'd be about it. If you wanted to do a full from the ground remake in terms of the same level that we see with something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, or even to this kind of style that we've seen from Final Fantasy 16, I'm not talking about the gameplay or anything like that. I'm just simply saying like the character models and that kind of stuff. That is going to take a lot of time. And based on what we know, they most likely have not been working on something like that. Maybe there's a smaller team working on some of that stuff in regard, but overall, I would probably say that would definitely take a long time. So what is the correct answer then? Do we make it a remaster or make it a remake? I don't really know what the answer is, but if you're somebody who does not like multiple parts or anything like that when it comes to a full remake, you're probably going to be in the remaster camp. If you're somebody who doesn't care and you don't mind waiting and seeing all the big updates and everything like that, then you're probably going to want a remake. But the fact that Yoshi P even made that comment, they know. They've most likely seen some of the comments when it comes to remake and some of the parts that it's been made into right now. Again, I'm personally fine with Final Fantasy VII being 3 parts. That's just the way it is, especially with all the extra materials that they have made ever since the original release back in 1997 up until now. Yes, Final Fantasy VII Remake in terms of part 1 definitely felt a little bloated when it came to the sewer sections and some of the extra stuff there, but overall I felt that it enhanced the story, and plus I just simply love the characters and everything like that. So if it meant having to go through a sewer an extra couple times, I was kind of okay with it. In terms of Rebirth, honestly, I didn't see any padding in that game, and I know everyone's going to point to the big towers from Ubisoft style gameplay and everything like that, but let me ask you a quick question. If you go back into Final Fantasy VII, the OG, and we didn't have that stuff, you're basically walking on top of a map essentially, There was kind of some quote-unquote bloat with that particular game, because guess what? You needed to level up your character to make sure you could get past particular parts in the game if you were too weak against particular bosses. So let me ask you something. Would you rather just randomly run around and battle enemies? Or would you rather run around battling enemies, but at least be able to see some cool new areas, see what the world has expanded into in terms of Rebirth, and maybe see some new places you might not have explored, anything like that? Because obviously the level of detail compared to the original Final Fantasy VII and the remake trilogy right now is obviously vastly improved. No shocker there or anything like that. So I really think that when it comes to the multiple parts of an actual big remake, especially with how meaty these JRPGs were back in the day, I think people need to understand that if you expect to see a full game of that size, but at this current gen's level of fidelity and everything like that, it is either going to have to be multiple parts, or it's going to be like a 400 to 500 gigabyte game, and that is going to take easily 8 to 10 years. But everyone keeps complaining that, oh, we don't want these long dev cycles. You gotta pick one, okay? And if that means simply that you get part 1 to Final Fantasy IX as a big remake, and it's an awesome remake and it works out and everything like that, then that is great. And then you simply go on, you play some other games, and when part 2 comes out, you then go ahead and play that. Or you do what a lot of people are doing with Final Fantasy VII Remake right now, and you wait until all 3 parts are out, and then you go on and buy it, whatever the case is. But overall, it's just simply saying that a remake of an old game is simply press the button and everything is updated and nothing else is really affected by it or anything like that. I think it's just a little disingenuous, and you really need to look at the details of this stuff. And then the final big part is just simply, would this even happen? Would Square actually do this? Especially looking at something like Final Fantasy IX. They've had some help, obviously, with it being exclusive to Sony and everything like that. I'm not going to get into exclusivity talks. We've already talked about that in other videos. But would Square take upon a project like this? Or would they try to push it out to a side company to potentially work on that together, or maybe have a completely new team work on it? It's really hard to say, because they also have to weigh the pros and cons to this, because if a game like this does not sell well, let's just say hypothetically, it releases on every single platform, but it doesn't sell well, that's going to deter them from trying to make any other remakes or any other big projects that might take some risks or anything like that. So that's just something to keep in mind there. So would this happen? Hard to say. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Overall, these are obviously rumors right now, and we have absolutely no idea when something could be announced. Maybe we see something at the Game Awards, we're not really sure. Final Fantasy always gets big announcements at particular game shows and events and everything like that, so we'll have to wait and see. Or maybe Square is just simply letting Final Fantasy VII Remake go on right now. 9's not even in their ballpark right now, and they're working on Dragon Quest and everything, because as of right now, my guess is they'd be using these HD remakes right now to kind of see how people react to these games, and then finally hopefully get us 12, because that's unfortunately been in some development hell. But I want to know your thoughts right now. What do you think? Do you think Final Fantasy IX could potentially get a remake? Would you rather see a remaster? Let me know all your thoughts down below in the comments as always. And if you want to keep up to date on everything Final Fantasy, make sure to sub to the channel and leave a like on the video, as it tells us that you enjoy this type of content. With all that being said though, I'm Talent Gaming. Thank you so much for joining the video. I hope you have a great day and week, and I can't wait to see you all in the next one. Johnny.